May 1941. The Atlantic is silent but tense. The largest German battleship ever built, Bismarck, pushes westward through the darkness. Contemporary propaganda portrayed her as nearly invulnerable, a fortress of steel with guns powerful enough to smash any opponent. Yet modern research shows those claims hid serious vulnerabilities built into her design. What truly reshaped how we understand her story are newly declassified Kriegsmarine and Admiralty files, combined with updated cost analyses in 2025. Together, they reveal Bismarck's final hours were not only a dramatic battle at sea, but a moment that forced navies to reconsider how ships were built, used, and paid for. To see why, we need to begin where it all started, at the shipyard. The birth of a superweapon. At Hamburg's Blohm and Voss shipyard, a project began that would define the scale of Germany's naval ambitions. Work on the Bismarck filled the skyline with steel and scaffolding, the hull measurements dwarfing everything nearby. It was not simply another warship, but the largest naval construction Germany had attempted, one that set new industrial records in both scale and complexity. Teams of engineers and laborers worked years under pressure, driving the shipyard around the clock as the design took shape. It was as much an exercise in national mobilization as it was in shipbuilding, with Hamburg transformed into an engine of heavy industry focused on one vessel. Naming the ship after Otto von Bismarck was no coincidence. In German history, Bismarck represented national unity and measured strength, and attaching his name to the battleship was a deliberate act of propaganda. The christening in February 1939 turned into a spectacle, complete with Adolf Hitler proclaiming that future officers must prove themselves worthy of the name. Linking the legacy of the statesman who once forged a united Germany with the ambitions of the Nazi state was a powerful gesture. It tied the vessel not just to steel and machinery, but to the story of Germany reclaiming prestige against foreign powers. Yet the numbers behind the project reveal the true weight of the gamble. Records confirm that building the Bismarck cost 196.8 million Reichsmarks, a staggering wartime sum. In dollar terms for that era, this translated to about $78.7 million in 1939, a figure that, when aligned with modern measures, equals roughly $1.3 billion in today's currency. By direct comparison, a Nimitz-class American aircraft carrier in recent decades has cost more than $4.5 billion to build, over 3 times as much. The contrast highlights that although the Bismarck fell short of modern carriers in scale, it absorbed a level of resources enormous for its time. This was not an average battleship. It was a concentrated symbol of what Germany was willing to spend for status at sea. The challenges of building such a vessel also reshaped the Hamburg yard itself. Blohm and Voss expanded dry docks and reinforced cranes to manage the colossal structure, while engineers developed heavy forging techniques to handle the armor plate. Specialized steel, unique fittings, and large technical teams drew on resources that could otherwise have supported smaller vessels or civilian output. In financial and industrial terms, all of it revolved around this singular construction effort, which amplified both the achievement and the cost of failure. The Bismarck, even before it sailed, functioned as a political weapon. Its towering size and sleek silhouette appeared in staged photographs released to domestic and foreign audiences, meant to project invulnerability. Reporters in London and New York noted its vast displacement and heavy armament, interpreting the launch as a direct challenge to Britain's naval supremacy. In Berlin, officials capitalized on the coverage, carefully releasing facts that exaggerated the sense of a nearly unstoppable warship. This was more than hype. It was a coordinated attempt to unsettle Britain while inflating confidence at home. Behind the grand images, the strategic gamble was stark. The total resources poured into the Bismarck, and its sister ship Tirpitz came at the expense of investing in alternative approaches, such as expanding the U-boat fleet that was already strangling Allied shipping. Concentrating so much on 2 surface raiders meant committing to a narrow vision of naval power. In effect, The regime wagered that prestige capital ships would deliver more influence than numbers of submarines or aircraft. The double investment was as much about psychology as about material force, and the gamble had to succeed to justify its cost. The propaganda frame worked hand in hand with the ship's existence as a real machine of war. In newsreels, the gleaming armor plates were presented as symbols of a reborn navy. State commentary paired the ship's tonnage and armament with the narrative of a Germany supposedly rising unchallenged in the Atlantic. Just as modern nations unveil stealth aircraft or nuclear submarines for their symbolic value, the Bismarck's launch was used to signal a rebalance of global power. The difference was how much more of Germany's limited wartime economy it consumed compared to its actual reach as a weapon. By measuring today's value against what was spent, the scale becomes more clear. At over $1 billion in modern dollars, the expenditure ranks the Bismarck as one of the most expensive one-off shipbuilding projects of its generation. Yet it carried none of the air groups, missile technologies, or global endurance of later carriers. More than a weapon, it embodied an argument that one ship could embody national pride and strategic leverage by its very presence. For Germany, the prestige seemed to justify the financial outlay, even if the practical risks were great. The Bismarck thus emerged as both symbol and machine, a vessel built to intimidate abroad while inspiring unity at home, financed through extraordinary sacrifice and effort. From its cost in Reichsmarks to its comparison with later naval icons, it stood as a high-stakes attempt to reshape naval competition on image as well as capability. But to understand how the ship's gamble worked in practice, we need to look beyond its price and its propaganda to the physical form that resulted from this investment, the warship as it was actually engineered. Engineering the legend. When the Bismarck was completed, she measured about 251 meters in length with a beam of 36 meters, making her one of the widest and most stable gun platforms afloat. Fully equipped for combat, she displaced just over 50,000 tons. This size placed her firmly in the top tier of the world's battleships in 1941, comparable only with the newest American and Japanese capital ships. Her protection scheme relied on the German formula of the era, a 320mm vertical armor belt protecting the waterline, heavy reinforcement for turrets and command posts, and extensive internal subdivision to help confine flooding. Her main battery consisted of 8 38cm guns mounted in 4 twin turrets, each capable of firing 800-kilogram shells to a maximum range of about 36.5 kilometers. These were supplemented by 12 15cm guns for cruiser and destroyer engagements, and a dense suite of anti-aircraft weapons intended to ward off hostile aircraft. The high-pressure steam plant produced over 150,000 shaft horsepower, giving her a top speed close to 30 knots. For a ship of her bulk, combining heavy protection with such speed was a notable engineering achievement, promising commanders the tactical flexibility to both outrun threats and pursue targets. Yet, as with many wartime designs, the performance figures reflected ideal conditions more than the demands of real operations. Wartime press announcements frequently quoted rounded numbers and projected peak efficiency. Later examination of surviving blueprints, fuel logs, and engineering records reveals limitations that undercut those headline claims. Fuel consumption at high output proved far greater than expected. The ship could briefly reach maximum speed, but at the cost of burning through reserves so rapidly that sustained high-speed maneuvers became unsustainable. Captured maintenance records from her first Atlantic sortie confirmed that even modest sprints consumed fuel at rates that left commanders increasingly anxious about range. Worse still, one torpedo strike during the campaign opened the forward fuel tanks, reducing reserves even further and sharply cutting the ship's endurance. For a vessel intended to operate as a long-range raider, the need for continuous support from vulnerable supply ships became a constant liability. These fuel constraints mattered because the ship had been designed for one core task, disrupting Allied shipping far into the Atlantic. But instead of independence, Bismarck's operational reach was bound tightly to support chains that stretched across dangerous waters. Once these were threatened, her ability to function as a commerce raider collapsed. Submarines, in contrast, could carry out those duties with less logistical burden and greater discretion. The mismatch between intention and reality was one of the ship's most significant compromises, a weakness invisible to wartime propaganda, but clear when revisiting the historical evidence today. In terms of combat systems, Bismarck deployed some of the finest optical range-finding equipment in the world. German stereoscopic devices mounted high in shielded towers provided remarkable accuracy in clear weather. This emphasis reflected long-standing German naval doctrine, which privileged daylight gunnery duels where visibility allowed precision fire. But the limits were apparent whenever conditions shifted. Radar systems had been fitted, specifically SeaTac sets, but their function was mainly for surface detection at relatively short ranges. Unlike the Royal Navy, which by 1941 was integrating radar directly into fire control systems, German technology remained less capable and more rudimentary in its application. In poor visibility or at night, British ships increasingly enjoyed a decisive advantage by directing their main batteries with radar cues, while Bismarck reverted to optics or incomplete radar data. Her guns may have promised devastating striking power, but how that power was guided depended on conditions the crew could not control. Armor protection, too, carried trade-offs. The vertical belt, thick enough to shrug off most direct side hits, gave the ship a reassuring profile of survivability. Yet the horizontal protection across the deck was thinner, measuring between 50 and 120 millimeters. That left the vessel particularly vulnerable to plunging fire from long-range heavy shells, which fell in steep arcs onto upper decks. German design choices reflected a bet on engagements at moderate ranges where side armor would dominate, but naval trends were already pointing toward long-range duels where deck strikes mattered more. This structural limitation, seldom noted in wartime presentations, represented another instance where practical resilience fell short of myth. Inside the hull, German principles of compartmentalization guided construction. Hundreds of watertight areas were designed to contain damage and prevent flooding from spreading. In theory, this greatly improved survivability. In practice, the human element introduced complications. More compartments meant more complex routes, greater reliance on coordination, and heavier communication demands. Survivor accounts after the ship's final battle revealed that damage control teams often became isolated, and communications broke down as areas sealed off and power failed. The ship's strength on paper, therefore, translated into chaos under fire, highlighting that resilience required human coordination as much as engineering. Taken together, these reassessments reshape how we understand Bismarck's reputation. On the surface, she embodied the triumvirate of speed, firepower, and protection. But each advantage carried hidden costs: high speed at the expense of fuel, formidable guns paired with less capable radar, and heavy armor offset by thin decks. The final image, cultivated by propaganda, was that of a vessel too strong to challenge. The structural reality was of a ship powerful under certain conditions, but constrained by her design whenever those conditions shifted. These trade-offs did not make the battleship irrelevant. She remained one of the most formidable surface combatants of her era. But they do reveal how fragile the balance was between appearance and reality. German leaders wanted the ship to signal invulnerability. In truth, Bismarck was an engineering achievement bound tightly to limitations that restricted how she could be used at sea. Recognizing those limitations is essential to understanding not only the ship itself, but also the choices that followed. And those choices would be shaped less by engineering than by strategy. By 1941, Germany's armies dominated Europe, but its navy faced a very different challenge: how to apply a capital ship like Bismarck in an ocean already patrolled by the Royal Navy. Germany's Atlantic strategy. By early 1941, Germany's naval strategy was shaped more by limits than by its battlefield ambition. Success on land had been overwhelming, but restrictions under the interwar naval treaties, including the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, had cost the Kriegsmarine years of development time. As a result, the fleet entered the war with only a handful of capital ships, but a growing U-boat arm already showing sharp effectiveness. This imbalance created a structural contradiction. The Navy fielded massive surface vessels designed to project prestige, yet the more practical tool for crippling Britain's war effort lay in submarines operating in the shadows. Grand Admiral Raeder, the Navy's chief, consistently promoted the use of surface raiders. He envisioned fast, heavily armed ships breaking out into the Atlantic from bases in occupied France, striking at Britain's lifelines of trade. Britain's survival depended on supplies from North America, and the fear in London was that raids against these convoys could strangle industry and food imports. The risk was genuine, and British planners considered the possibility of catastrophic disruptions if German warships roamed unchecked. But in reality, sustaining such operations would always exceed German capacity. Long-distance surface deployments required fuel reserves, repair capabilities, and secure bases that Germany had never fully secured. The potential impact on British trade was therefore recognized more as a dangerous possibility than as a permanent threat. For Raeder, the Bismarck represented the centerpiece of this plan. She was designed to pose an unmistakable danger to any convoy, armed to match Britain's heaviest warships and fast enough to run from unfavorable encounters. Her role was not only to smash through escorts and scatter convoys, but also to carry symbolic weight. She embodied Raeder's belief that surface action, if bold enough, could restore Germany's naval reputation. In official communications, he stressed the advantage of decisive commerce raiding. But documents declassified in 2025 reveal something more complex. Privately, Raeder admitted that no surface fleet Germany could build in the near future would outperform Britain's or sustain long campaigns. He understood the Bismarck, however impressive, was not a long-term strategic answer. Still, with Hitler demanding visible proof of naval power and the regime eager to publicize superweapons, Raeder advanced the plan anyway. This contradiction created a tension between theory and execution. In theory, battleships were the hallmark of sea control, massive formations determining command of the oceans. Submarines, by contrast, were the perfect tool of sea denial, forcing supply lines into danger without seeking great fleet battles. The Bismarck sat uneasily between these two approaches. She was too large to operate invisibly, too few in number to contest the Royal Navy for real control, and too vital symbolically to risk without consequence. Sending her into the Atlantic meant advertising her presence and guaranteeing a British pursuit. In so doing, Germany undermined the very principle of commerce raiding, unpredictable strikes that avoided a fight whenever possible. Meanwhile, the U-boats were achieving the results the naval staff had hoped surface forces might deliver. From late 1940 into 1941, flotillas of submarines sank Allied shipping at rates that alarmed London. Convoys became central to Britain's defense, and Winston Churchill himself named the submarine war the greatest danger facing his country. Here, the logic of sea denial was working as intended. Anonymous, sustained pressure draining enemy capacity. Yet submarines lacked spectacle. They generated statistics, not headlines, and could not deliver the imagery of burning warships to fill propaganda reels. For Hitler and sections of the Navy, prestige mattered. A battleship like the Bismarck seemed to promise the morale boost and global impact submarines never could. The political climate in Germany reinforced this. Reports confirmed that leaders in Berlin exerted pressure for visible, rapid demonstrations of naval strength. While the professional staff increasingly invested in the U-boat arm, they still could not ignore the power of a single dramatic surface action for propaganda value. The decision to deploy Bismarck was less about strict naval arithmetic and more about political demand. Sinking enemy warships or convoys under the guns of a German battleship promised a powerful spectacle, even if the long-term benefits were questionable. Newly analyzed planning documents show how this compromised reasoning shaped the coming operation. Raeder and his officers, acknowledged that the Royal Navy outmatched them, so any deployment had to avoid direct confrontation. The concept was to use Bismarck not as a sustained raider, but as a diversion. Her presence would force British capital ships to abandon established patrol lines, giving other units, like Prinz Eugen or U-boat packs, greater freedom to strike shipping. In practical terms, this was always a gamble. A single battleship on extended operations, without reliable overseas bases or secure logistical support, carried enormous risks. Thinkers within the naval staff understood this, but they proceeded under political pressure and with cautious hope that surprise and speed might allow at least one breakout. What emerges is a picture of naval planning driven by conflicting imperatives. On paper, Germany's Atlantic strategy demanded sustained disruption of Britain's trade routes. Submarines were already proving up to that task. On the surface fleet side, however, the Kriegsmarine lacked the numbers and infrastructure to make such pressure continuous. Still, admitting this limitation publicly was unacceptable. Officials promised aggressive action, and Raeder provided it in the form of Operation Rheinübung. This plan vividly illustrates the split between what officers knew professionally and what the regime demanded politically. By the spring of 1941, the balance was clear inside naval headquarters. Submarines stood as Germany's true weapon of sea denial. Battleships remained politically powerful but strategically fragile. Yet the Bismarck was complete, equipped, and expected to prove its worth. Its existence had to be justified, if only as a mark of prestige. Instead of concentrating on expanding the one arm of the Navy capable of sustained results, Berlin pressured its admirals to risk a capital ship on a mission both sides privately knew was unlikely to succeed. This was the dilemma that defined Germany's Atlantic strategy. Too few tools for genuine sea control, a preference for raids that its largest ships could not conceal, and a commitment to display power even at the risk of rapid loss. Raeder himself foresaw the contradiction in his notes. Surface raiders would never win the long contest with Britain's naval strength, but the order still stood. Against that backdrop, Bismarck received her marching orders. The decision to send her out was not the product of pure naval logic, but of politics, pressure, and the chasing of symbolic victories. What followed was the attempt to turn Germany's greatest battleship into a weapon against Britain's lifelines, a mission that carried with it immense risks from the moment she sailed. Operation Rheinübung, the gamble. In late May 1941, Bismarck left her Norwegian anchorage under cover of darkness. Alongside her sailed the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, smaller but fast and well armed, intended as both scout and escort. For the first stage of the voyage, a small group of destroyers accompanied them to provide protection from submarine and air attack. But their limited fuel supplies forced them to turn back once clear of the coast, leaving only the battleship and cruiser to continue into open waters. This marked the beginning of Operation Rheinübung, Germany's bold attempt to thrust surface raiders into the Atlantic. The plan was simple on paper: slip into the ocean, hunt Allied convoys, and strike at Britain's vital supply chains. In practice, the mission demanded extremes of stealth and endurance, conditions that many German officers doubted could be sustained. Vice Admiral Günther Lütjens led the task force. A cautious and procedural commander, his reputation was built on discipline, adherence to orders, and minimizing risk. He placed doctrine before improvisation and favored restraint in combat over reckless action. On Bismarck's bridge, however, stood a captain of very different temperament.